Watch this video if you quickly want to learn modern JavaScript. I'm Wesley and I've been a full stack developer for years myself. So about JavaScript, we can use it to build websites and web apps, mobile apps, desktop apps, server apps, and even games and AI and virtual reality apps. JavaScript is different from Java. They were created around the same time, but they're completely different. And the technical standard is actually called ECMAScript, or ES for short, and it has new versions every year. So I'm going to use Chrome. If you look at the statistics, most people in the world use Chrome. We need a program to write the code in. Now the most popular one is Visual Studio Code, right? So you can just Google that. So to install Visual Studio Code, just click on the button here and it should pop up in a moment and you can just go through the steps. Alright, I have opened up my code editor, which is Visual Studio Code. Alright, so step 1 of any new project is to open a folder. Second step is to start creating files for your project. It all starts with HTML actually. So when I go to a website like Airbnb.com, if I would press enter here, the first file that we actually get back is an HTML file. And now I can write HTML, pick the second option, and it will give me an HTML boilerplate. It's important that we know a little bit about HTML and CSS as well. Now I want to open this up in the browser, so I can click and drag this onto the top part of my browser. All right, now let's say I want to style this. The HTML is for the raw information, you could say, and then usually we want to style it to make it look better. Dot and then the class name dot text. Right, so if I refresh here, it doesn't work yet because we are not linking to our style sheet here. So very important, you can see the HTML file as sort of the entry point. So you're going to give the HTML file to the browser. Right, browser is going to go line by line, but nowhere here right now does it see anything with CSS. So I can write link. It's in the same folder, so we can just write style.css. If I now refresh, it's red. You can also have a fav icon, a font, or a script file. Right, so let's start talking about JavaScript. So let's say we have a script file here as well. And now, of course, we need to link to the script file as well. Now with script files, it's a little bit strange. We don't write link, we actually write script. And the problem with this is that it will block parsing the rest of the page. In the past, people solved this by putting it at the end of the body, not very fast. So these days in modern JavaScript, what we can do is we can keep it in the head and we can add the defer attribute. And if you write it like this, you can also just write it in short like this. There are about 9 essential concepts in JavaScript that you really need to understand. If you understand these, I consider you to be a JavaScript developer. Let's say I have some kind of number, 5,000. Maybe this is a price of something. I cannot just write random numbers in here like this. Usually you want to store them somewhere. We use variables to store something. So we can say var price is 5,000 and then a semicolon. So this is a number type. We're assigning that to a new variable called price. This entire thing is a statement. So we use a semicolon at the end to indicate the end of the statement. The downside of var is that I could accidentally overwrite this somewhere else. So these days, instead of var, people tend to use const. This is a constant, so I cannot do this. If I do this, the program will give me an error. However, sometimes we do need to change the variable. We don't want to use the var keyword because var has other downsides. We want to use the modern let keyword. And so a lot of developers have adopted the system of always using const unless you actually need to reassign a new value to the variable. In that case, use let. Right, I will still call price a variable even though I'm creating it with the const keyword because it still belongs to the category variables. Now let's talk a little bit more about the data types and structures in JavaScript so we can have a description of something. That's a string. You use these quotation marks and this could be just some text, right? New apartment. You can use single quotation marks or you can use double ones. It's usually a bit easier to write single ones. So I just write single ones, but they work the same way. We also have numbers like we just saw. Okay, we can also have booleans. Do you want a new floor? Right, so then that can be true or it can be false. Then we have arrays. An array is a list of something. I have options for the floor. We have an array here with square brackets. It can be hardwood. Right, so it's a list of elements. And here we're using 3 strings, but we could also add numbers here, right? Or booleans, or even another array. By the way, if your variable name has these 2 words, new floor, in other programming languages, people use kebab case, that's with a hyphen, or snake case, underscore. In JavaScript, we have so-called camel case. Especially during development, you want to work with the so-called console. So we can right-click, inspect, and it will actually give you, in the Elements tab, it will give you the HTML of this page, and then below here, it will give you the CSS. There's also the console tab. I can write JavaScript here. Right, so I could say something like AS5 and you're gonna get this weird undefined. That's not important for now. That's simply because this statement here doesn't really return anything. So I can also do this. Now for tutorials, people dock this usually on the bottom. And then here I can output something to console, right? So here in my script file, if I just write hello, this variable does not exist, so we get an error. However, if we write console and save here and refresh, we do not get an error because the browser actually gives us something called console. So we get console to interact with this console here in the browser. I can log options, right? I get the whole array It gives you the length as well, and you're going to see this weird prototype thing. You can ignore it for now. You don't really use it. Sometimes you want to log the length. If I refresh, we get 3. So there are 3 elements in the array. If you want to know the first element, you could use square bracket. It starts with index 0. So if I save here and refresh, we get hardwood, but not hardwood. And if I want to see the second element, I actually have to use the number 1. It's 0 index based, so 0, 1, 2. So objects are used to represent something, right? So I can have an apartment, and then we have curly braces, and then here we have properties. So the apartment could have a price, let's say 300,000 square meters, 500 or something. Right, maybe is it furnished? The answer is true, yes. Right, so here all of these statements, they're just some loose statements. They're not connected in any way. Sometimes we want to connect certain information. We want to associate them together. So we use an object for that. Another common object is, for example, an error object. These 3 properties now are associated together to represent something bigger than them. Right? The advantage of these objects is that it becomes easier to reason about our code because we have these entities to hold in our head. Now, if you want to access any of these properties, you can just write dot notation. So the dot price, and you get the value for that property, or square meters, you can access it like that. Let's continue with functions. So these are all statements. Statement 1, we're assigning a string to a variable called description. And only when that is finished do we continue with the next statement. So these statements run as soon as this script gets executed. But sometimes we want to group statements together and maybe run them at a later point in time. We use functions for this. So it's a function keyword, and then we can give it a name. We can say calculate price, parentheses and curly braces. There's no semicolon here. And in here, we can put the statements. Is 5,000 bedrooms is 3. And then maybe we have something like price is whatever the square meters is times the number of bedrooms. Right, so now if I refresh, nothing happens here. Right, even if we try to log the price, if I refresh here, we don't see anything yet. And let me comment this out, right? So we can write comments in JavaScript like this, 2 forward slashes. You can also select all of this, and then for me it's control forward slash. And this is just a comment. It's not really code that will be run. It's just for the developer. Here, the browser will eventually go to these lines. It will see the function, but it will not run the statements in here. It will just create the function in its memory. If we want to run the statements in there, we have to actually execute the function like this. We have to call the function or execute the function. Now, if I save here and refresh, we do actually see something logged, right? So we see 5,003, 5,000 times 3 is actually 15,000. We can also do plus, we can do minus. Now what you have to understand about functions is they can also have input. So instead of hard coding 5,003 here for square meters, maybe we're going to pass that as input to this function. So these are also called parameters. Right? So now when we call this function, we have to give the actual arguments, right? So the actual values are called arguments, and this specification here, these are called parameters. So now if I refresh here, we get the same result, because when we call this, the browser will assign the number 5,000 to square meters and the number 3 to bedrooms, and then we can just still multiply them, right? So here we have 2 parameters. You can also have 1 parameter, right? And then maybe hard code this, it still works, right? But let's continue with 2 parameters here. We can call this whatever we want. We can call this blah blah, but then you do have to use the blah blah word here instead of square meters. So whatever you put here, it's going to assign this value to whatever you put here. All right, now what if we don't log this? If I just save this and refresh, now what happens? Nothing actually. We just make this calculation, we assign it to price, and then what? Well, the function just ends and we don't do anything. So typically you also want to return something from a function. So we can return the price. Right, so this is a statement, it's the return keyword. But what happens when you do return is this will actually sort of be replaced with whatever you return. It would get 15,000 here. Right, so we want to assign that. Let's say we want to assign it to a variable called result, and then we can log result. Right, so if we do this and refresh, you can see we still get 15,000. Right, so here with return, this will be 15,000 essentially assigned to result, and that's what we're logging here. Right, that's what happens when you return something. You can also just do this in one line. Right, so you don't have to create a whole new variable and then return that variable. You can also just do this in one line and you get this. All right, this is called a function declaration. Another syntax, an old school syntax, traditional syntax is the following. So you would create a variable called calculate price, and then you would have an anonymous function. So this is actually a statement because we're creating a new variable and assigning something to that. So here we do have the semicolon, and then we can have the same statements in there. In this case, we just have one statement. So here we have the same essentially. So this is a function. It doesn't have a name, right? So we don't have a name now, but it still does the exact same as before. And we're assigning this function to a variable called calculate price. So we can still use calculate price to call or execute the function. So if I refresh here, we still get the same result. This is called a function expression. It's also a bit traditional. Now we have some innovation here. So these days we also have arrow functions. So we would say const calculate price Now we don't have the function keyword. We have a fat arrow here, right? And a semicolon at the end. And then the statements stay the same. The parameters here we would specify here, square meters, bedrooms. We can still use the same word when I calculate price to run the function. So we still get the same result. The arrow function is a bit shorter, as you can see, because we don't have the function keyword. Instead, we have this fat arrow, right? So this is the arrow function. It doesn't have a name, and we're assigning that to calculate price. So it can still sort of derive the name from that. You can put all of this on one line. I can get rid of the semicolon, I curly brace like that, and then we can even remove the return keyword. Because if you put it on one line like this, it's an implicit return. So it knows that you intend to return this, the result of this. You don't have to write the return keyword. So now this is the arrow function in its most compact form. This is a function, and it does the same as this one, right? And this one. But it's much shorter syntax, as you can see. It doesn't have a name, but we're assigning this function to calculate price, so we can still use calculate price here to call it, right? And just to prove this to you, if I refresh here, we still get the same result. If I change these inputs to 1000 and maybe 2 bedrooms, save and refresh, we still get a result here, right? If you only have one parameter here, by the way, right? If you have something like this, you have one parameter. In arrow function, you can even leave off the parentheses. So this is the most compact form of a function in JavaScript. Right, so this is the evolution of functions in JavaScript. You will see arrow functions a lot used these days as so-called callback functions, or when you need to supply a function as an input. Often this is used, but you will also still often see this function declaration, so this traditional syntax as well. The function expression, I have to say, you don't see that often anymore. So it's mostly the function declaration and the arrow function. All right, let's continue with scoping and hoisting. If I have some function, calculate price, let's say, and the only thing it does is log the number 5000. Then I can call the function here, right? If I refresh, we actually see 5000. But what happens if I do this? Can I call the function before we have created it? If I do this, yes, we actually can, because the traditional function here, the function declaration, gets hoisted. So practically you can imagine it sort of gets hoisted to the top of the file. And so you can still call it. If this was an arrow function, so if I convert this to an arrow function, if we try this and save and refresh, we actually get an error. So you cannot do this with an arrow function like that. Right, so here you have to create it before you call it. This is actually a variable. Right, so this is the function, and we're assigning that here to this variable. All right, let's say I have a function here. I'm going to create a variable here. Right, so I create a variable in the function. Can I log the price here? Can I access the variable price outside of this function block? So let's see. No, we cannot. Right. Also, if this is let, if I try to access this, no. Right, so let and const variables are scoped to their nearest block, meaning whenever you see these curly braces, the const and let variables can only be accessed in there, not outside of there. That's scoping. Let's talk about string concatenation versus template literals. This also has received some innovation. Your total cost is colon, and then I want to use whatever the price variable is. Can I just write price like that? Let's see what we get. So if I save here and refresh, we will get your total cost is literally price, the word price. That's not what we want. I want to get whatever the value is of price. So you can do string concatenation. You can use plus, and then you can use variable price. If these are two numbers, plus is just mathematical addition, but here it's a string. So it will see this as adding this, whatever this is, to the string. If I save here and refresh, we actually do see 5000. We also have template literals these days. So let's say I have description, and now I use backticks. And then a semicolon here. So these are backticks. Your total cost is colon. And now to use price, we cannot write it like this, right? So here in template literals, we stay within the backticks, and we can use $sign curly braces with price. Save, refresh, we still get the same result. This is very helpful if you have, for example, multiple lines of code. Right, so if you want to insert HTML, for example, often you work with very large strings or templates, and you have a lot of lines. These backticks, template literals are very helpful. All right, let's continue to control flow, as it's called. So we can have a price of 5000, and then in here you can say if some condition is true. So if price is more than 2000, let's say, we want to run some statements here. We'll just have one statement here. Otherwise, else, we will log false. Right, so if we save here and refresh, we see true, because what we're saying here is essentially 5000 is greater than 2000. This is a true statement, and so we go in this block. If this was false, we would go into this block, right? Not in here. These statements would not be run. Price is greater than 10,000. This is false, right? So now if I refresh, we don't run this statement. No, we go into this block where we run console log false. You don't have to use else. Sometimes we only want to use if. Now we have some innovation here with a ternary operator. So we can say, is price greater than 10,000, question mark. If this is true, let's say we want to log true. Else, colon, log false. Right, this is the same as what we did here, just shorter syntax. This is nice if you have a simple condition like this. If you have a lot of conditions in here, or you have a lot of statements, it's easier to use the if-else old school syntax. But now if we do this and refresh, we get false. right? If I make this 2000, or if I make this 5, let's say, refresh, we get true, right? This is a ternary operator. All right, let's talk about some of the operators we have in JavaScript. We can log price plus 50. Let's see what we get. We get 1050. We can do minus, basic mathematical operations. We can do multiplication as well. By the way, we've already seen that. We should get 50,000. All right, so then we have a lot of comparison operators. So we can say if price is greater than 200, console log true, else console log false, right? We can also check if it's less than, right? So we should see false now. Yeah. Now, what if we do this? Price is greater than 1000. Right, so here indeed we get false. But what we can also check for if it's equal to. So now we're saying price is greater than or equal to 1000. So now we get true. We can also just check, is the price 1000? Right, so to check if it's actually equal to something, we use double equal signs, not one. One is assignment. Right, so here we're assigning the value 1000 to a new variable. And here we're going to check, is that variable equal to the number 1000, and it's true here. We also have triple equal signs, and if we do this, we also get true. What's the difference between these two? Right, so maybe this 1000 is coming as a string, right? Maybe because we have some kind of string in our application with the number in there. So let's say we have this string 1000, and that's false. So this is strictly equal, so it's going to check for the type as well. If you do two equal signs, it's a bit looser in terms of comparing it, so it will not take the type into consideration. So here it will say true. Typically in practice, you want to be strict with yourself. It reduces the number of bugs. So if you can, try using the strict equality sign to be as strict as possible. Let's say we have some different variable, new floor. We can also just do this, right? So new floor is actually the Boolean true. So now we will always get true, but we also have the not operator. So here you can invert it. So new floor is the Boolean true, but here with the exclamation mark, it will become false. The entire thing becomes false. So now we indeed go in here. All right, let's continue with this price a little bit more. Let's say we also have square meters. Now we're going to look at the logical and logical or operators. So we could have something, if the price is greater than 200 and square meters is less than 1000, right? So with logical AND operator, both of these sides have to be true. So this has to be true and this has to be true in order for the entire thing to evaluate as true. So if I do this, we get true. If one of these is false, right? So if we make this 5000, now this is false, right? But this one is still true. But because one of them is false, the entire thing evaluates to false. So now we get false. However, if you use the OR operator, only one of them has to be true in order for the entire thing to be true, right? So here price is greater than 5000 is false, but this is still true. So the entire thing is still true, right? So here we get true. Let's continue with Truthy and Falsy values in JavaScript. So sometimes people will do this, if price, right? But price is just a number, it's not a Boolean. So what's going on here? What's going to happen here? Let's see what we get. So we actually get true here. So if we just do price, right, which is just a number, if we just do this, for some reason the browser will see this as true. However, if we do the number 0, we get false. But this is the concept of Truthy and Falsy values. So here with number 0, it's not explicitly false, but if you force the JavaScript engine, in this case it's going to be in the browser, if you force the browser to classify the number 0 as either true or false, it will say, okay, 0, it sounds a bit negative, you know, it's empty, it's nothing. So it's more false, it's falsy. It's not explicitly false, but it's falsy. That's kind of false. It will classify it as false. It will evaluate this as false, and so we log false. Any other number, however, like 5000, it will say, okay, 5000, it's more in the direction of true. It's not explicitly true, but it's kind of true. It's truthy. So here if we refresh, we get true, right? So any number is truthy except 0, which is falsy. Also with strings, for example, if I just have some string, this will also evaluate to true, except an empty string. If it's an empty string, it will be false. Right, most important to understand is empty string and the number 0 are falsy. Everything else is essentially truthy. There are some exceptions as well. Okay, so almost finished here. Let's continue with loops. Very important in JavaScript. Also a bit tricky, so don't worry if you're not completely comfortable with this. Let's say we have some kind of list, or if you want to have a list, you use an array. So maybe we have those options for floor again and stone. Right, so just a list with 3 elements, or it's an array with 3 elements. And maybe we want to do something for each element in the array. And I already said it, for each one, right? So we actually can do something with the array. We can say the options and then for each, right? So this is something we can do on arrays, and we can run some statements, right? So you have to remember, a JavaScript program is just a sequence of statements, one after another, essentially. And we can group those statements in a function, right? That's all what a JavaScript program is, essentially, just a sequence of statements. Now let's say we want to run some statements for each element in the array. So we use for each, and then here we can specify the statements that we want to run for each one. Now we don't just loosely write the statements in here, right? So you group statements together in a function. So we have to supply a function here. So we can use traditional syntax, function. We could give it a name, but we're never going to use it outside of here. So we never have to reference it again. So typically when you have to supply a function, these are called callback functions, you don't really use a name. It's sort of a throwaway function. We don't need it here. Only here where we have to supply it to for each. We want to run this function for each one. So in a function body, we have those statements, right? So we can run some statements here, right? So statement 1. I can duplicate this line by holding Shift Alt down arrow key, right? Statement 2, statement 3. So now if I do this and refresh, what's going to happen? It's going to run this function for each element in the array. So we're going to start with hardwood, right? So for hardwood, it's going to run these functions. So we see statement 1, statement 2, statement 3. And then it's finished. And then we go to the next one. It's going to run these statements. So we see statement 1, 2, 3 again. We go to the last one and it's going to run the statements again. Now the browser also gives us access. As we go over each one, it gives us access to that element that we're currently on. And it will give us that here, as it will assign that here to whatever name we put here. So we could say blah blah. Right, let's say we just want to run one statement here. Let's actually just log blah blah. And we actually see all the elements in here, right? Because this function first is going to be run for this element here. It's going to assign the actual element value to whatever we put here as the parameter name. Then we can just use it here. It will console log blah blah hardwood. Then we're going to go to the next one. It's going to assign carpet to blah blah. That's what we're logging here. Now, typically you do want to have a descriptive name for your variables. Floor option perhaps would be a little bit more descriptive. Every element here gets dash option added to it. However, we can also use a more general purpose loop, the for loop. This used to be a very popular loop in JavaScript, but this array method, as it's called, is for each one, has mostly replaced it in many cases. So here, usually you create a variable, usually called I, and initially it's going to be 0. Then we want to run this loop as long as I is less than 2, let's say. After each round, we're going to increment this I variable by 1. We can do that in JavaScript by adding ++. It will just increment it by 1, right? So 0 will become 1. Then in here, we just have the same statements as before. Now the browser doesn't just give us floor option, right? So now we need to access the elements in the array a little bit differently, right? So here options, remember to access elements in the array, we can use square brackets, right? So here we would actually use the I variable, right? So you can already see it looks very complicated compared to this one. Let's try doing this. Let's see what we get. So now we only get the first 2. So how does this work? So we're going to start with I is equal to 0. It's going to check, is 0 less than 2? That's true. So we're going to run the statements here. The only statement we have here is we're going to log options at I. Well, I is 0 initially. So it's going to be hardwood. It's going to concatenate that with option. That's what's going to be logged. That's what we see here. That's the end of the first round. So then here we specify what to do after each round. So here we're going to increment by 1. So now I is 1. And we're going to check, is 1 less than 2? That's true. So we're going to run the statement again. But now options I is 1, right? So this could be carpet. Carpet plus option, you get this. That's the end of that round. We're going to increment I again. So we're going to check, is 2 less than 2? That's false. The loop stops. That's why we only see two values here. If we make it 3, we actually see all of the array elements here. Right? So the advantage here is with for each, you're going over literally each one. Imagine if you have a large array with thousands of items, it can be bad for performance to literally go over each one. With 4, maybe we only want to go over the first 2, right? So it can have better performance. And for each can only be used with a list, with an array, right? With 4, it's more general purpose, so we can use it in other contexts as well. However, it's more complicated to use, and most of the time you do actually want to go over each one. So most of the time you should actually use for each. It's nicer syntax, and the performance these days is not a huge issue. These JavaScript engines, the browsers, they're super quick these days. All right, so last major concept that you need to know, let me save and refresh here, is how to interact with the HTML and CSS. Another word for this is interacting with the DOM, or if you're changing something, DOM manipulation. So remember, if I just write some name here, hello, we will get an error, right? Because we haven't created anything with hello and any variable with hello. The browser also doesn't give us anything with hello. If I write console here, however, we don't get an error here. So the browser actually does give us something console. The browser actually gives us this interact with the console in the browser here. But now let's say we want to interact with the HTML. So here you could say, so the browser gives us something else as well, document. If I do this and refresh, we also don't get an error, right? So clearly this document exists, and this is coming from the browser, right? So the browser gives us, it's going to go through all the HTML, and then it gives us this document variable here in JavaScript so that we can do something with it. Let's say we can do pretty much anything we want, but let's say we want to change the text here from hello into something else. So first we would have to get a reference to this element, and we can actually use CSS selectors, right? So it's just in CSS, if you want to style it, you first have to select it. Same with JavaScript. If we want to do something with it, you have to get a reference to it first. We have to select it. In our JavaScript, we need to find this element element in this document, right? So you can also see this HTML as a document. So it's also called document object model. This is a document object. Right? So in this document, we need to find this element. So what you can do on a document is you can use query selector. Right? So we're gonna query this document with a selector, and these are actually just CSS selectors. So we can just use a CSS selector here. So we're going to select by class. This will give us a reference to that HTML element, and we want to store that somewhere. But we use a variable for that. I like to append L to the variable name if we're storing an HTML element in there, or a reference to the HTML element. So now let's see what we get. So if I log text L, save here and refresh, here we actually get the element. If I hover this or click it, you can see it actually shows us on the page that we have selected this element. All right, so now we can manipulate this element. So we can say it's text content. We can set that to something. Maybe we want to set it to welcome. When I refresh, you can see it has become welcome. Another common thing is, let's say we want to insert some HTML. Let's say we want to wrap this in span tags. Let's see, will it create a span element if we do this? Let's see if we refresh. No, it will actually literally write span here. So if you actually want the browser to parse that as HTML, you want to use inner HTML. So now we don't see span. And if you go here to the elements tab into text here, you will see it now has this span around it. So the browser actually parses this as HTML and will create an HTML element out of that string here, right? So that's text content versus inner HTML. Another common way is, because now we're always replacing this, right? So here initially it's going to be hello, and then as soon as the browser execute the script, it will become welcome. So we're replacing it. Sometimes we don't want to replace it. We just want to insert something adjacent to it. So on top or after it. So we now have hello. And let's say instead of replacing it, we want to insert this right after it. So we can use insert adjacent HTML. So it will still be parsed as HTML. And now it's a function actually. So it's slightly different. So we need to specify two things. What we want to insert, that's what we're doing here. But actually before we do that, the first argument here should be where. So it could be before the end, right before the end. So if we do this and refresh, you can see it has now added something. It hasn't replaced it. Right? So these are three common ways of inserting some kind of content into the page. Text content, inner HTML, and insert adjacent HTML. Let's say we want to run this statement when we actually click on an element, not just when the script, runs. So here we work with events. We have to start listening. We have to hook into it first. So on this element, we already have a reference. We can say .add event listener. And here we can specify which event we are listening for, right? So here, for example, I could enter with my mouse. That's actually an event, mouse enter. That's an event. I can also leave with my mouse. However, usually it's actually click. So when there is a click, we want to run some statements. Now we don't specify the statements loosely like this, right? So we group the statements together in a function. So we can write function here. It doesn't need to have a name because we're never gonna reference this function later. And then we're gonna put the statement in here, right? So what we're saying here, when there's a click, run this function, and that means this statement. So now when I save and refresh, and now if I click, you can see we are adding this welcome text here, right? So this is a traditional function that we run when this event occurs. We could also use an arrow function, just replace the function keyword with the fat arrow. I save here and refresh and click, it still works. In practice, people actually usually create a separate function for this, so a standalone function, typically named after the type of event that's being handled. So click handler, or handle click. And then the statement would go in here. And then here you only have to reference this function by its name. Right, so if we do this, save and refresh, it still works. Right, so here we're telling the browser, when there is this event, run a function with this name. Could also be the function declaration syntax. The actual syntax for the function doesn't matter. We just have to reference it by its name now. Common mistake here is that people write this. So now we're saying execute the handle click function. That's what this means. So as soon as the browser gets to this line and it sees this, we'll run this function. But that's not what we want. We don't want to run this function at the point of adding the event listener. We want to run this function when this event occurs, when there is actually a click. So we just have to reference it by its name, right? So that's manipulating the HTML. Now what about the CSS? There are two ways to manipulate the CSS. Let me reset everything here. So the quick and dirty way is to use the element here and then .style. So here we can say the color should be blue, for example. Right, so now the color is blue. You can also set the font size. All the CSS properties work in. Now in CSS, you would write font size with the dash. In JavaScript, you have to use the camel case. Right, font size can be 100 pixels. Right, that's huge. So we now see it down here. Typically this is a bad practice because let's say we're also changing the color to blue, for example, and let's make this a little bit smaller. And now what we get is this, but now we start to have all of this CSS scattered and littered in our JavaScript file. Typically you want to have a clean separation. So you do want to confine the actual CSS value into the CSS file, right? So you would actually create a special class, for example, text special, here blue, and font size 50 pixels. And so now we're confining the actual styles in the CSS file, and now we can just add this class. And so the second way of manipulating the CSS is by using class list, because this element has classes. It can have multiple classes, and now it has only text, so it will get these styles, but now we're also going to add this class. You can add classes, remove classes. We're going to add something here. We don't have to use a dot because it already knows it's a class, right? We're using class list. And now if I refresh here, it still works, but this is a bit cleaner because now we don't have the CSS littered around our JavaScript file. It's confined into the CSS file here with its class in its rule set. Well done for making it this far. This was a quick overview of modern JavaScript. I highly recommend you go through my JavaScript course if you want to become a professional JavaScript developer. If you want to work with the front end, it's also crucial that you know CSS like Flexbox, CSS grid, animations, and transitions. I also have a course on that. Definitely check it out in the description.
By the way, if this was helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Also, check out my courses on CSS and JavaScript if you want to take those skills to an advanced level. Because in there, we will build some beautiful real-world projects from scratch so you can see how everything fits together and really master CSS or JavaScript. And I will also release other courses soon like React and Node.js. So if you want to be notified, then make sure you are subscribed to the email newsletter. You can find the link in the description. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon.